As of this Tuesday, upcoming Tuesday, we will be launching the Imagination Institute, where it is the main purpose is trying to understand how can we develop imagination and how can we test for imagination. Maybe someday we come up with like a really good imagination IQ scale, where IQ would stand for imagination quotient and not necessarily intelligent quotient. As Kitty mentioned, these are my friends and very prominent cognitive neuroscientists, Rex Jung and Mark Beeman. And today's talk on what is creative genius is going to be focusing very much on the biological, neurological level. But I hope you'll be able to see that through this level of understanding, a lot of things might make sense, a click in place for you in terms of your understanding of the creative process and what do imaginative geniuses, basically all you guys in this room, imaginative geniuses, what are the main core mental processes and things of that nature. So let me get started. Can I have this little clicker? Thanks. So many of you have probably seen, raise your hand if you've seen this ad before. Bless you. So there's a lot of talk in popular culture lore that we have this right side of the brain that is very poetic and sensual and what are other things listed in this ad? That's the creative side. The right side is the creative side. And when you're walking on a beach and it's and you're feeling that feeling of the sand beneath your feet, that's the right side of the brain that's active. And then as opposed to the left side of the brain, that's a really big downer. Like the left side of the brain is like the realistic side of the brain, the side that's very logical and analytical, and we'll say, ouch, that sand is too hot. Doesn't feel good at all, right? And that notion is this sort of dichotomy of right side, left side is huge oversimplification. And as I think all three of us will be talking about today, it doesn't fully capture what it really takes for creativity, the whole process of creativity. So the whole process of creativity involves lots of different processes, lots of different motivations. You're constantly changing your emotional state. You're changing the various different levels. Sometimes you want to focus really hard on what you're trying to do and accomplish the task. And sometimes you want to get rid of that and just let loose and let the ideas flow. And what cognitive neuroscientists and other psychologists of creativity, which we have some big names in this audience right now. We have Keith Sawyer right here, who's giving his own talk later, trying to understand what are the determinants of all these different processes, so looking at this process stage. So instead of this oversimplification, I want to present to you the reality of the matter, which is really this. Okay, this is really creativity. In a lot of ways, is a whole brain phenomenon. Right. So in a lot of ways, when you look at the whole creative process, it involves lots of what are called large-scale brain networks, which all that means is there are a lot of team players in our brain, lots of brain regions that work together, that interact, that communicate with each other to solve certain problems or to process certain information in the real world. And this will have deep implications, as you'll see, for how creativity works. So I'm going to go through some thought processes that are obviously important for creativity, and I'm going to leave out insight, so there's not as much overlap between all three of us. But one, I think we can all agree that imagination is important for creativity. Does anyone here think that imagination is irrelevant to creativity? We had an interesting discussion with some people this morning. It seems like a great driver of imagination is discontent with reality. And if you look at a lot of the greatest creative geniuses of all time, people that we stamp that label genius on, they seem to be incredibly discontent with their reality, whether they had a learning disability or whether they had a parental loss or any myriad of factors that can influence them being kind of an outsider and not being satisfied. So people who have it too good tend to not be as imaginative in the sense that don't seem to be as motivated necessarily to imagine. So that seems to be a big one. But I think we can all agree that the thought process of imagination is something that is a thought process that all of us have. It's part of a great gift of human evolution, or God, whatever you believe. And the question is, what do people who you bring to a laboratory and have really vivid imaginative thoughts, what is different with them and what's going on differently in their brain than those who come in and can't really generate many alternative possibilities and various things? So one task that psychologists use is called the divergent thinking task. Raise your hand if you've heard of the divergent thinking task. I'm going to measure all of your divergent thinking abilities right now, okay? So I want to pose this question to all of you. What would happen if people could become invisible at will? I want to give you a couple, give you a minute. I'll be fair, like at least in psychology experience, we give you a minute to think about this. Just think about this and try to generate some ideas. And then we get a chance to compare it to responses from people in our laboratory who've come up with creative responses. So just let the associative network of your brain, the ideas flow. Don't be inhibited. I suppose I should be counting. Okay, that's a minute. But what are some responses? What would happen? What would happen? Yeah.
Just like a loss of privacy or security for people that are
Yeah.
curious to be voyeurs into other people's lives. And
Yeah.
security as in trying to, figure out how to do something to the person so that they're not aware of it.
Yeah. Yes.
I think criminals would love it.
Yeah, I always get that response. I wonder, why. It's like criminals would have a field day with that one. Right next to you, yeah.
You can just skip the line at TSA.
Oh, TSA would not like that. Yes.
And children would be harder to manage.
Children will be harder to manage, yeah. Right behind you.
It'd be a catalyst for new forms of conversation. We destroy the fashion world.
Goodbye, fashion world, yes. Let me just get two more. I feel like you guys are a very imaginative group. You're generating so many possibilities here. I'm overwhelmed with your possibilities. Cool, so let me get you, yeah?
I actually took a different perspective
Yeah.
and said it would increase the fashion. We'd all be caring about it because if we disappeared doesn't necessarily mean our clothes would.
Do you want to respond to that, sir? Yes.
I think it's very positive. I would be able to go into meetings of leaders of the world and hear how things are done or not done.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. You're obviously not a 13-year-old boy. His response will be different about where he would go. But anyway, yeah, let's just get one more, sure.
You'd probably bump into everyone because you couldn't really see them. So if you were walking, you couldn't really see anyone and would bump into them. But if you were invisible, what if someone else was invisible? If you were invisible and the other person was invisible, would you be able to see them because you're both invisible?
You both would be part of the same alternative universe. And yes. Wait, we'll check my rule book. Yes. Yes. Yes.
That weren't invisible would bump into everyone.
That's right, yes. Great one. So let me just go on a little bit. So let me show you some responses of actual subjects who are, what you do in these kinds of studies, you get a bunch of raters to rate from multiple dimensions how creative the responses were. How rare were the responses, how original were they, how flexible were people in changing categories, things of that nature. So here's some creative responses. Very shy people would have sex while being invisible. I should say these were college students, not 5-year-olds answering this. So, yeah. If you could see only beautiful people on the beaches. Cops would wear infrared goggles. Paparazzi would be more effective. It would be harder to play hide and seek. You could escape a bad date. I really like that one since I've gotten an OkCupid lately, and I'm like, I would love that ability. Okay, so that's irrelevant. So here's the question. You study this, and then you look to see those who got really, really creative responses, those who less creative responses. What do their brains look like? You put them in an fMRI scanner. What's going on there? What's really differentiating them? And I want to introduce to you guys today two of these large-scale brain networks, these team players, that I think are especially relevant to our understanding of creativity. And one is, we can call it the attentional control network. This is exactly what it looks like. And the attentional control network mostly involves regions of the outside lateral surface of the brain, communication, very efficient communication between the frontal lobe right here and the parietal lobe up here. So things are zipping, through the white matter tract really fast. People tend to people who tend to have really fast and efficient communication between these areas of the brain here. What do they tend to be good at? They tend to be really good at concentrating on a task. they tend to be really good at ignoring distractions. They tend to be really good at flexibly controlling their attention. So knowing, okay, now I really need to shift mindset to this. So they're really good at controlling their attention. They have high working memory. So they're able to keep lots of different things in their head at once and maybe integrate it. So they tend, surprise, surprise, they tend to do well in IQ tests. And that was actually a big discovery that Rex and his colleague discovered, is that this brain network is, people who do really well in IQ tests tend to be really, have high activation of this network. But I want to contrast this brain network with a network which I've been calling recently the imagination network. Psychologists call it the default mode network. So more traditionally, the default mode network. But I want to make a case today why this brain network really is, all of these functions that are part of this network really are a part of human imagination. So why is it called the default mode network? Well, this is actually a pretty big discovery in cognitive neuroscience. About 15 years ago, so prior to 15 years ago, most psychologists were only interested in the stream of thought that was relevant to the task that they came up with. And so they ignored the inner stream of consciousness. They ignored all those dreams, those memories, daydreams, the fantasies, all the things that are going on when you're going through a boring psychology experiment. They called it noise. That's what they called it, right? But the past 15 years or so, psychologists have started to wonder what actually is going on when people are not necessarily paying attention to what we're forcing them to pay attention to. And what they found is that this brain network is very active at rest, but it's anything but passive. Okay, so the neat thing that I think has been discovered in the past, the kind of reframing of this network in only maybe the past 5 years, is this is actually a very active network. And it involves lots of different processes that I think all tie together into imagination. So let's just take a little tour of some of the latest research showing what this brain network is related to. So remember, this brain network is associated with IQ and control, attentional control. Well, this brain network is associated with mind wandering, daydreaming, planning your future, so thinking about, how am I going to propose to her next week, things like that. Self-awareness, reflective compassion. So there's research showing that those who read a vignette of the plight of a poor child in another country, if you give them more time to reflect on that experience, you find that this brain network becomes more active. And their responses are more compassionate. Reasoning about moral dilemmas, reading fiction as opposed to nonfiction, obviously. Retrieval of deeply personal memories. So this is interesting. It seems that the same brain, the same underlying hardware that is active when we're imagining the future, it relies very much on our ability to remember the past. Okay? So there's huge overlap there between our ability to imagine and our ability to access our deeply personal memories, as well as facts and figures and lots of things that come from that hippocampus area that's part of this brain network. Evaluation of social, emotional implications of another person's situation, monitoring your own emotional state. So there's neat research on meditation that has come out recently showing that if you have a certain kind of meditation where you don't, how there is the kind of meditation, of mindfulness meditation, where you're supposed to, like, God forbid you daydream, it's like, no, must not daydream, like, return to the breath. But there's a new kind of meditation called non-directive meditation, and they've done studies on this showing that if you actually allow people to really get in touch with that inner stream of consciousness and their emotions, you find that this brain network shows much more activation, but you don't get rid of the other good stuff like cognitive control or attentional control. So there's still benefits in allowing people to have this more open-minded way of mindfulness where you don't ignore that inner stream of feelings and thoughts. Reflective consideration of the meaning of your experiences. So this brain network is really important for creating and constructing that self-narrative, the narrative of yourself, that ongoing self-narrative, and mentally simulating the perspective of another person. So if I'm trying to imagine, is she enjoying my talk at all right now? What it is, it's imagination, right? That's why I think all these things are part of imagination. I'm trying to imagine what her mind is and how her mind is different from my mind. So that's why I call it the imagination network. And interestingly enough, the part of this network that is the most active, Rex knows this is my favorite brain network, it's called the precuneus. Okay, so if there's one word you remember today, just precuneus. That's all you need to know. It'll make you sound very smart. But it is the part of the brain, it's the medial surface right there, that is most active at rest. So when people leave us alone, and stop telling us, do this task for me, do that task for me, and we're left in solitude and we're allowed to really get in touch with our own consciousness, this brain network is most active. And this brain area, the precuneus, has been associated with representations of yourself, with self-consciousness. Some consciousness researchers think this might be one of the most important brain regions for consciousness. And this brain area does have relevance for imagination and creativity, because what they found is that when people who are really good at divergent thinking, those kind of items I told you about, which you guys are all good at, they're able to, people who are really good at that kind of stuff, they're able to simultaneously activate that attentional control network, right? So you could see how you need to concentrate on the goal and then try to focus. But what are you focusing on? You're focusing on that inner stream of consciousness, right? So attentional control doesn't always have to be used to focus on other people's goals or focus on a boring lecture, which I hope you don't find this boring, but focus on, a teacher or something like that. The interesting thing is that has been found is that this executive control network can be used to block out all of that and can be used to really focus and insulate yourself from the outside world to really get in touch with that inner stream of consciousness and imagination. And people who have the most imaginative responses seem to be those who can access both of those brain networks at the same time. Okay, so they're not antagonistic to each other at the same time. And going further, there's to the mental illness link. The same exact brain signature has been found in people not with full-blown schizophrenia. I once made a joke and said the brains are indistinguishable between that and people with schizophrenia, and that joke didn't go down well, so I'm not going to recreate that joke. But the thing is, you find that people who have something called a personality trait called schizotypy, raise your hand if you've heard of schizotypy. It's like schizophrenia light. You don't want to think of it. It's not a mental illness, by the way. It's a personality dimension that everyone in this room differs on. People who really score really high in schizotypy are very high in magical thinking. They do tend to be very imaginative, but they also tend to be relatives of those with full-blown schizophrenia. So it seems like when those genes are passed on, they're kind of like watered-down versions of full-blown schizophrenia, but it seems to be something that's very, very conducive to creativity because people with schizotypy and creative people, even without schizotypy, are able to simultaneously activate these things. So what does it mean to simultaneously activate these things? To me, I think it just simply means that creative people are able to keep on call their inner self, their memories. They're always able to keep on call their life storehouse of personal experiences. For any moment that when they encounter something in the environment that's relevant, they can boom and make that connection. And I think Edgar Allan Poe said it quite well. Do we have any Edgar Allan Poe fans in this room? Excellent. Great. So I think he said this quite well. He said, "Men have called me mad, but the question is not yet settled whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound does not spring from disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect. They who dream by day," and by that I think he's just saying those who keep their precuneus active, like throughout the day, are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. In their gray visions they obtain glimpses of eternity and thrill in waking to find they have been upon the verge of the great secret. So I think that was really great. How much time do I have left, by the way? You like the way I said that and read that? Yeah. So we have some fellow Poe fans here. I basically am done. So that's okay. I'm going to pass the baton to my colleagues. I literally have 0. Is that right? You weren't joking, right? Like, I'm done? I'm done. Okay. So let me just impress upon you today, just the final point is that creativity doesn't just involve this intense cognitive control and concentration and following. It exists, in my view, creativity exists in that intersection between that outside world and that inner stream of fantasies and daydreams. So let's not get rid of either. Okay, thank you. And then,
that's great, Scott. You just gave my talk, so I'm going to have to do something a little different. Yeah, tap dancing will be. So I am going to do something a little different. I will give part of my talk, but I think I'm going to riff off something that you said at the end, which will shorten it a bit. So I don't know jack about genius, and if you came here for genius, I think I've experienced near genius, which is that feeling that you have a moment of insight, that aha kind of moment, and that happens about once twice a year, and I think it's fueled by too much coffee. And so I kind of have a flavor for what genius might look like, but I do know a bit about creativity, and have come at this, as Scott was saying, from the perspective of intelligence research. So spent a good portion of time looking at intelligence. So when I approach this question, I always like to look backwards, because we're usually trotting over ground that has been covered before. People have thought about these things in the past, and we usually are inevitably rediscovering things that have been covered in the past. So it's important to look at the past. And there's this person, Henri Poincare, who looks kind of intimidating in this particular picture, and he is kind of intimidating. He's a very famous mathematician, polymath, very bright genius, who really did some introspection about his own creative process, about how he did his creative thing in the sciences and in his writing. And he came up with 5, actually. It was later trimmed to 4 different processes associated with creativity. So the first thing that I want to kind of put in your head is that creativity isn't this nebulous thing, that there's several stages of creativity that we can start to disentangle through the cognitive neurosciences. The first stage, or something that we have to understand about creative cognition, is preparation. You can't pull something out of nothing. And this 10-year rule, which is an average, by the way, some people do it shorter, some people take longer, is probably right. Picasso didn't pull Guernica out of a hat. He took many, many years producing lots of different things before his great masterpiece of Guernica emerged. And he has some 20,000 individual pieces of art that they have uncovered, some of which are quite crappy if you take a look at them. And I was very excited to go to Germany one time and go to a museum that had some plates of Picasso, and it looked like something that a child had done. He's trying different ideas out. He's playing with ideas, and this preparation phase is very important. Incubation is something that we study very importantly, and this is probably most analogous to this imagination, this imaginability, this ability to turn inward in your mind's eye and think about your own thought processes. Divergent thinking gets at that, and there's any number of apocryphal stories of Beethoven's long walk and Hercule waking from a dream and thinking of a snake swallowing its own tail and thinking of a benzene ring. And then there's also Ernest Hemingway, who preferred another method to induce incubation.
Speaking of which.
Yeah, this is downregulation of some of the constraints of the external world, where you're trying to get away from external problem solving and get into that internal problem solving mode. Illumination is what Dr. Beeman is going to be talking about, this aha, this insight moment. It is not inevitable to the process, but it is often that you move an idea from unconscious processing to conscious processing, from this workspace of internal thought processing to external thought processing. And a moment of illumination will be had when you realize that the idea has come fully formed. Archimedes is kind of the most famous example in his bathtub, where he's taking a bath and he's trying to think about how you might measure the amount of gold in a crown. And he comes up with the idea that you can submerge it in a bathtub and you can measure the density of this gold in a crown. And then verification, you have to check to see if your idea is going to work in the external world. Is it valid? Is it useful? Will people find this idea to be valid out in the external world? That check is a critically important part to the creative process. I also like to think about evolution of creativity. It's important to think how this reasoning process arose in the first place. I mean, we have reasoning capacity. We have this brain that allows us to meet demands of the environment. How did that arise in the first place? And we have Cosmides and Tooby, evolutionary psychologists, who have talked about different reasoning capacities in the brain. Luckily, I'm not going to read this whole passage to you, but they talk about two main reasoning capacities in the brain. One which is broad in application, and one which is powerful and limited in its domain of application. Think about the types of problems that you have to solve out in the world, and the vast array of problems that you encounter in the world, the millions of potential problems that you have to encounter in the world. Some are very familiar to you, and you encounter them every day. Some require specific improvisation on a time scale that is very short. You have to be able to solve both of these types of problems. And I think there's two types of reasoning capacity involved in this problem-solving process. And when I studied intelligence, I was very much talking about deductive problem-solving capabilities. But now, you have to look at different species as well. So it can't just be that humans are creative, but other species, and across evolutionary time, we must see this reasoning capacity across different species and across evolutionary time. So here you have an example of Tursiops aduncus. This is a type of bottlenose dolphin that has figured out that it is doing fishing at the bottom of Shark Bay in Australia. And if it uses this sponge, basket sponge, it can protect its beak and scratch across the sandy bottom and have these small fish arise out of the sandy bottom and catch them. It's protecting its very sensitive beak. This is a very deductive type of rule-based problem solving that this shark is doing. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have situation-specific improvisation. So you have a rule-based system, you have situation-based improvisation. Perhaps the best example of that, and this is the first brain I'll show you, is Homer Simpson. Our best example of situation-specific improvisation. We have an image of his brain, which is quite interesting as well, and it teaches us something that will lead into the rest of the talk, that sometimes smaller is better, that oftentimes we're finding that in terms of intelligence, it was bigger, better, stronger, faster won the day with intelligence. But with creative cognition and with this default mode network, we're finding something different. And I use structural imaging techniques instead of functional imaging techniques that Mark is going to talk about in order to look at these correlates of brain, of creative cognition. So let me walk you through that very quickly. So where is it? That's the $64,000 question with creativity or intelligence or genius. Where is it in the brain? And as Scott was saying, it's many places. It's everywhere in the brain. But it's also very specific places in the brain that we're starting to look at. And when I started to look at creative cognition, I was asking very broad questions, and I was casting my net, if you will, across the entirety of the brain when asking where is creativity manifested in the brain. And we had three rather foundational studies that asked this question, how is creativity manifested in the brain? The first one looked at brain biochemistry, and we can't look at the whole brain. I'm not going to walk you through all the techniques, but we looked at brain biochemistry, and we asked, where does this certain brain chemical, N-acetylaspartate, which is found only in neurons, predominantly in neurons, where is it correlated with creative cognition in the brain? We had found previously that it was correlated with intelligence. And we found something very interesting. It was in the anterior cingulate cortex, the frontal part of the brain. It's a very important part that kind of gates information as it reaches the frontal lobe. But the relationship was inverse. Higher NAA, higher brain chemistry, lower creativity as we were measuring it with these measures of divergent thinking, as Scott was talking about. Second, we wanted to look at the cortical mantle of the brain, the processing nodes, the computers, if you will, on the surface of the brain. And it varies between 2 and 5 millimeters, the cortical thickness on the surface of the brain. We asked the question, where is the cortical thickness across the entire surface of the brain correlated with our measures of divergent thinking? Again, we found this very puzzling response, or this finding, that it was an inverse relationship, that cortical thinning in this region of the frontal lobe, in the orbital frontal cortex, was correlated with higher levels of creative cognition, a disinhibitory type of network. It was as if less cortical thickness was allowing ideas to propagate more fully throughout the brain. Finally, we looked at the white matter, the wires that connect up these different cortical networks in the brain that allow different regions to communicate with each other most readily. Ask the question, where is creativity manifested in the brain? And we found a particular region in the frontal lobe. It's called the anterior thalamic radiation, not my favorite portion of the brain, that was correlated with creative cognition. Again, it was not as cool as the precuneus. It was an inverse relationship with higher creativity, lower connectivity in this particular region of the brain. So this is really an interesting story when we look at the structure of the brain and how it is related to creative cognition. And when we looked across all studies of structure as opposed to function, which Mark will talk about here in a moment, we saw something very interesting, that there were certain regions of the brain where you saw structure-function relationships that were positive, where increased cortical thickness, increased fidelity of the brain was associated with higher creative capacity, but there was a large number of brain regions where it was the inverse was true. So this was very interesting to us and has led us to notice an overlap between these regions and what Scott was talking about with the default mode network and the cognitive control network. Where the regions are blue, it tends to overlap with the default mode network, these regions where you see lower brain measures of fidelity associated with higher creative cognition. That's the second major idea. Now, to shift gears, there is an idea that I'm playing with currently, if I can get to it quickly enough. And this is it. And this gets back to Scott's idea that creativity and intelligence are probably both important to this notion of genius. And creativity has something to do with this default mode network. And this is novel and useful problem solving. It's involved with abductive reasoning, abstraction and metaphor, imaginability, divergent thinking, blind variation, neuronal disinhibition, and at the extreme, psychosis. All ideas are connected to each other. All things are related to me. At the other extreme, you have kind of intelligence types of measures where you have useful problem solving, deductive reasoning, cause-effect relationships. The cognitive control network is involved. Selective retention of ideas is involved. Both of these are critically involved to creative processing. That's why you see this dynamic interplay of the default mode network and the cognitive control network. At the far extreme of this is autism types of disorders, Asperger's types of disorders, where rule-based behavior predominates. So this is a very interesting dichotomy that I think pulls the default mode network and the cognitive control network together in ways that you were talking about. Thanks,
Cool model.
Mark.
Well, thanks, Rex. Is my mic on yet? Okay. So I'm going to try to give my talk in a different style. We were encouraged to try to be more conversational and to avoid PowerPoints. And as Rex might be able to attest to, for a scientist giving a talk, I have to tell you that PowerPoints or Prezi, as you're using, is basically like heroin or crack. So I might be in a little bit of withdrawal at some points in here, and you're probably just coming down off your high right now. So, So I might have to go back and forth, and I have to look at some notes a little bit. But besides giving it in a different style, so I'm going to mostly avoid some slides. I might go into withdrawal and show a few later. But I also am taking a different scientific approach. And my approach has been, in a nutshell, or to give you the real brunt of it, I want to know what was going on in Archimedes' brain when he sat in the bathtub and had that seminal eureka moment. And of course, we think that's important not because of that one event, but because it actually relates to things that happen to all of us in, as you referred to, it's sort of like our moment of creative genius. And it may be when you're coming up with a new scientific theorem or a new invention or a new way of making business decisions or a new business strategy, or how you organize your closet. It's all could be a very creative moment, and I think that's within each of us, and they happen on occasion. And yes, the big ones are rare. But sometimes we have some really small ones when you're solving the crossword puzzle or playing Scrabble or something like that, and they're kind of fun and addictive, and but they're also emblematic of one important type of creativity. So why do I want to study this? creativity is very complex and has a lot of different components and varieties of creativity, and my brain is really small, and I can't understand all of it at once, so I have to concentrate on just one part of it. And it turns out, you may not be surprised to learn, the brain is kind of complex too. So giving a sort of a hardcore focus to one small area of creativity that isn't necessarily going to explain all of creativity at all, but it relates to some creativity and is certainly an example of a type of creative processing. It allows me to get a better foothold into creativity, creative processes generally, and also actually to serve as sort of a model of how a variety of tasks work from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, that is how the brain thinks. We're going to try to zero in on this one type of creativity and look at specific brain areas that are involved, and not just what brain areas are involved, but the time course of their activity and what type of activity they involve. So insight's important in a number of ways, and one is, I would like to emphasize again, it's not just a rare event, doesn't just happen in ancient Greeks, or it doesn't just happen in scientists, and it isn't always called a eureka moment or an aha moment, but sometimes it is. And so a somewhat more modern example was Barbara McClintock, who was a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist, and in her biography, she outlined a number of very creative problem-solving moments that she had, and she specifically said that she had these eureka moments. So for instance, when they were studying a particular trait that was being passed down through these corn varieties, and they had predicted it would show up in 50% of the offspring of the corn, as it were, and it was only showing up in about 25%, and they were puzzling over this, 25 to 30% of it. And she was literally out in a cornfield one day, walking through, when she jumped up and said, "Eureka, I have it." Eureka translated as, "I have found it." And that also actually sort of exemplifies what's going on when you have this eureka moment. It's not, I derived the answer step by step, but I found it, it's there. Suddenly it became visible to me. And so she jumped up and said, "Eureka, I have it," and she ran back to the lab and she tried to explain to people what the answer was, which was that there happened to be 3 copies of this gene. It was a trisomy, and so and that was allowing the trait to show up in a smaller percentage of the offspring. But then she had to work hard at trying to explain to people how she came up with this or why that was right. When it came to her, she just knew it was right, and she literally said, "Eureka." So that sort of starts to exemplify some of the characteristics of insight. And the Archimedes story, I always say, you mentioned like some of these stories are apocryphal, and some people doubt, some scientific historians doubt that the story is true about Archimedes in the bathtub, or that it's at least exaggerated, and we can't know, right? When I tell my students about the Archimedes example, and I say it happened 2,000 years ago, some of them, they're still young, they're thinking, "Did you know him?" But I'm not really that old, so I can't ask him, and he's not very cooperative. So, but there are some modern day people. Even Barbara McClintock was, I wasn't able to ask her before she passed away. But there are some other modern inventors that I have had the opportunity to interview. So one of them is Jerry Swartz, and Jerry Swartz was the head of a company called Symbol Technologies. And if you recognize that name, if you ever go to you're shopping at Home Depot or even a grocery store, and someone pulls out a handheld price scanner, it probably says Symbol on it. That's the company that Jerry founded. And he actually invented the handheld price scanner, at least the first one that was practically applied. What happened was that he was stuck on a problem. This is characteristic of insight, just like Archimedes was stuck on how do you measure the volume of a crown. It's so irregularly shaped, we can't measure it geometrically like we would for most objects. Well, Jerry knew about price scanners. There were already countertop price scanners in use, although they weren't very widespread at the time. This is about 1980. But the countertop price scanners had a lot of different moving lasers inside them that they were using to shoot off the laser beams and record back the reflectance in order to record the UPC code that was there. But nobody could figure out how to put a bunch of heavy moving lasers inside something that you could hold in your hand that could be more portable. And Jerry had worked on this and been stumped and more or less given up on it. But it was in the back of his mind somewhere, incubating. And then one day he was playing with his kids. And he was playing with a laser pointer. I'm not sure which one's the laser pointer here. Okay, he was playing with a little laser pointer. But back then, the laser pointers was like actually a big laser with almost like a gun sight coming out of it, a long metal tube coming out of it. He was showing his kids that, look, no matter how far away it is, it's still just this little dot of light. And he was shining it out the window on the cars across the street, and he'd move it. And then if a car was moving and he moved it up and down, it actually ended up, because of the car's movement, it ended up making sort of a sine wave pattern. And Jerry was saying he was having all his fun with his kids doing this, and all of a sudden, boom, the idea came to him. He knew exactly how to build the handheld price scanner, and he was very excited. He continued playing with his kids for a little while, then he went up in his room and he started drawing out the plans, and he had essentially a cascade of insights. He knew at that moment exactly how to do it. And he had an insight like, yeah, actually, maybe this gun shape of this was actually pretty good. Maybe people know how to like pull a trigger on something that'll trigger the price scanner, and what we'll actually do is we'll have a single laser in there with multiple moving mirrors that would reflect the patterns in different ways that would allow us to record back the whole pattern of the UPC code. So this characterizes, like the Archimedes legend, it characterizes a lot of the aspects of insight. One is you're generally stuck on a problem. Your normal way of solving it, using your intelligence, your analytic solving of step-by-step methodical processing, and your expertise isn't working. And then at some moment, you have to, in order to overcome the impasse, you have to reorganize or restructure your conception of the problem. You have to think about how different things are related to it. And it's usually believed that unconscious processing is important for that to happen, because many of these anecdotes say that people had this when they weren't trying to think about the problem. There's debate about that, what really constitutes unconscious and all that, but at least a different, less attentive form of processing seems to be helpful. And when the answer comes to you, it comes to you with a great deal of confidence. It's surprising because you weren't thinking about it, or maybe you were thinking about it, but not from that way. It's kind of like I was thinking about solving the problem this way, and all of a sudden, boom, the answer jumped in from another angle. So it's surprising, but it's also you're very confident about it. You already know, as soon as it comes into consciousness, you know that the answer fits all the constraints of the problem. And that confidence gave Jerry Schwartz the ability to work out the rest of the problem that day and go into his lab the next day and start building the first handheld price scanner, for which he got a patent that made him rather wealthy. So, like the Archimedes example of solving the crown in the bathtub, this emphasizes a lot of the different descriptions of what seems to happen with insight. And as Rex alluded to, I'm as a brain scientist or as a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm interested in examining the function of the brain, the processing of the brain. And so looking at the aha moment gives us a particular advantage, because if we wanted to look at the creativity for writing a novel or doing any other sort of long-term creative process, we couldn't just stick someone in a scanner for the whole process and see how it unfolds. But the aha moment gives us a marker. Something just happened. You were aware of it, and something just happened that allowed this thing to pop into awareness. That doesn't mean that all of the processing happened at that moment, and we'll sort of talk a little bit about the steps that build up to it. But something just happened then, and we can use that to say what was going on at the brain at that moment, what built up to it, and what kinds of things either facilitate or perturb having that moment later on. The other thing about focusing on the process is that it can vary quite a bit. I'm more interested in the process than the product. So this idea of looking at creative genius, society tends to judge creative genius, but a process might be creative for you or for me, even if you could have solved it with your sort of routine, analytic, methodical kind of solving. So I might be sitting around with a bunch of loose papers from the Aspen Institute trying to figure out how I'm going to schedule my time here. And I can't keep track of all these papers, but I have a piece of wire lying around, and I figure out, gee, if I bend this wire in this really interesting little pattern, I can stick the pieces of paper together and hold them there, and I'm all excited. And that might be a big aha moment for me, or a big creative process, and you'll be rather bored to discover that or to think that I discovered the paperclip. So it wouldn't be judged creative or let alone genius by you, but it was a creative moment in my brain. So we can look at creative moments in people's brains even if they don't actually lead to some genius production, because we can't go back in time. After society has judged something to be genius or creative, we can't go back in time and look at their brain now. So we have to look at things sort of online while they're happening. Okay, so it turns out that even this seemingly simple event has multiple, and it seems to happen in an instant. It has, of course, it's a culmination of multiple brain events happening in a coordinated network, like Scott alluded to earlier. And that, more generally for cognitive neuroscience, this provides an example of me about how different types of events can interact and how they're modulated by things like mood and attention in order to allow different types of information processing to occur, whether they're creative or not. But how can we study this? Well, as I mentioned, we can't go back in time and look at Archimedes' brains, and even if we knew who the next Archimedes or McClintock or Marie Curie or whoever you want to choose, we knew who the next person was, we couldn't just stick them in a scanner, if they were willing, to wait until they had their next aha moment. We need a lot of them. We need 20 or more different instances of an aha moment. So we give people some short, solvable problems that have a single word answer or short answer. And the problems that we know you already have the expertise to solve, or at least we hope you do. So if you're native English speakers, you can solve this because it's really just sort of wordplay or word associations and so on. So and then we're trying to extrapolate from that up until like these bigger moments of creative genius. And we're starting to look at some people who have had more creative events in their life and see if they're showing the same kinds of processing in our lab tasks as they do in the real world. But we look at these moments of genius and we look at these moments of aha, and we look at these multiple measures of neural activity to see what brain areas are active and when they are and their time course and the type of activity that's going on in the brain, because it's not all the same. And we also look at sensitive measures of behavior, the timing and different aspects of secondary tasks that we can give to people. And we also sometimes use eye tracking to sort of more directly assess how you're actually attending to the problem that's out there in the external world when we're presenting it to you versus how you're attending to your internal thoughts. So what have we found? Well, first of all, we found that insight is different from analytic solving or more methodical solving, and that's good, and it actually was not necessarily an outcome that everyone would have predicted, although most people would have at least thought that there's something different about it. And of course, we found that it's not one single brain area and not one single moment. And while that makes the answer sort of more complex, it's actually kind of a good thing. Because if I was to say, oh, this is the insight area of the brain, and that's that. This area only does insight, does nothing else, and it does all of insight. Well, what good would that do you? I couldn't say, okay, if you want to facilitate insight, turn on that brain area. Because I don't know if any of you know how to turn on a particular brain area, but I don't. There are people working on doing this actually, but nonetheless, it's hard to do, and turning it on in the right way would be difficult as well. So it's kind of good that it's more complex. So what have I found? Well, at the moment of insight, if you look at the last 2 seconds of what happened right before the solution emerges into consciousness, we see several brain areas being active. In our first paper, we talked mostly about one. What happened is that in the right temporal lobe, we see in both fMRI and a particular type of EEG, measures of neural activity, we see this right temporal lobe becoming suddenly active. We think that was important. We actually predicted this area because this is an area that's involved in other things too that involve pulling together things that are distantly related. And that's often what you have to do with creativity and certainly with insight. You have to pull together aspects of the problem that didn't initially seem related. We also saw areas that are involved in memory, like the hippocampus, and we see this bilaterally, which is an important memory area, and it probably is suggesting that different types of memory are involved either in retrieving the insight or in actually storing it, because there's been a lot of anecdotes that people really well remember their insights and in a particular way. And in our lab, we've actually begun to see this, that you do remember your insights differently and better, and that has implications as well. Out in the real world, which might be why educators and psychotherapists and sometimes even lawyers want to actually elicit aha moments from the people that they're working with so that people can remember them and use them in the future. And then we also see an area called the anterior cingulate cortex, which Rex referred to a little bit earlier. And it's a very funny brain area. As you mentioned, it shows sort of anti-correlations with some of these processing. And we see this as being an important area. It's a deep midline area involved in attention or cognitive control. But what it's doing in these, prior to solving my insight, is it's actually relaxing your attention a bit. Because usually you use attention to focus on one thing and squelch the distractors. But to come up with a creative answer, sometimes you have to actually ignore the dominant solution and pay attention to the weaker, more distantly associated ones. And so relaxing that network helps you. And we see that there's various ways in which you can relax it, such as being in a positive mood, like after you've laughed for a while. And we see this whether people come into the lab and they're already in a positive mood or whether we induce it by having them watch some comedic films. And the flip side of that, by the way, is not sadness or negative mood, it's anxiety. Anxiety causes you to have this hyper-focus, or what people call weapons focus, which is great if you want to keep focusing on the weapon so you don't get distracted by the pretty butterfly when you're being threatened by some some lion on the safari or a gun in a dark alley. So we found a number of these different things, and actually we see them in a variety of different kinds of problems. We see them in these problems here that we use where you get 3 words like child, scan, and drain, and you have to come up with a 4th word that can form a compound with each of the 3 words. And I don't have much time, so I know some of you probably have solved it and some of you would like to work on it, but yeah, the answer is brain. In this case, you should have been primed for that, because you can say brain child, brain scan, or brain drain. Or it can give you another one like tooth, heart, or potato. Now, if your Anterior or Cingulate is not working quite right, you're probably stuck on ache, because you can say toothache and heartache, but as far as I know, potato ache doesn't work, and neither does ache potato. So I'll give you the answer in a minute. But we've also seen similar patterns in the brain activity, even when people are solving visual problems like this one. So what is the object in this picture? This is a famous one that Gestalt psychologists use. So it's a Dalmatian, and I'll let you work that out for yourself. And you can see that sort of all at once or piece by piece. But if you actually solve that by having the whole thing just pop out at you all at once, you actually see a somewhat similar pattern of brain activation as you do for these verbal problems. So what we see is that people solving these kinds of problems always have a similar network of brain activity, and it overlaps with some of the information you got earlier about the overlap between sort of intelligence or executive function systems and more default mode or imaginative kinds of systems. That your attention, your state of attention actually matters. And a lot of people often ask how to facilitate insight. And one thing I point out is that you don't always want to. You have to be at the right stage. Oftentimes you just still need to be working on the problem more analytically. But when you're at the right stage, then manipulating your attention so far is the best way we've come up with of being able to sort of facilitate your ability to come up with proper insights. And actually I have a good quote from another person who was a famous scientist who was also introspective and looked into how he had his insights, and I'm going to end with that. So Hermann von Helmholtz, late 19th century neurophysiologist, said he had a number of great insights into the field of psychology and neuropsychology, and he said, often these ideas arrived suddenly, without any effort on my part, like an inspiration. They never came to a fatigued brain and never at the writing desk. It was always necessary, first of all, that I should have turned my problem over on all sides to such an extent that I had all its angles and complexities in my head. Then there must come an hour of complete physical freshness and quiet well-being before the good ideas arrived. Often they were there in the morning when I first awoke, which you heard reference to, but they liked especially to make their appearance while I was taking an easy walk over wooded hills and sunny weather. So with that, I suggest that you attentively listen to today's talks, think about them deeply, and if only there was some place you could take a walk on a sunny day in the woods.
Thank you. So I feel like, I don't know if I'm still on, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't report this finding. I just finished a huge cross-cultural study on like 20,000 people to see where people get their greatest inspiration. We found that most people get greater inspiration in the shower than they do at work. It's quite depressing.
Actually, one of the John Lasseter, I think, the head of Pixar, he has a shower at his work for that reason.
So maybe you should install. So we have some time for questions.
Oh, sweet potatoes, sweetheart, and sweet tooth. Yeah.
Drake?
We have some other ones you can work on while you're talking.
Not. Yeah, absolutely.
First, thank you so much for enlightening all of us. I'd like to bring in a term from the philosopher Dan Dennett, who talks a little bit about cerebrocentrism. Do you think that with the research into how gesticulation is a part of thinking, the various growths of embodied cognition, as well as, say, Antonio Damasio's work with the way your gut is a part of the way you process things, are we fully appreciating enough how much the body or our perceptions, or at least things that aren't gray matter, are a part of our thinking and our creativity?
Yeah, well, a large part of the default mode network is the ability to get in touch with your inner emotions and embodied cognition. So I do think we're underestimating the extent to which really getting to know what certain functions and emotions mean and using that in an experiential way is conducive to creativity.
We have some really interesting preliminary findings. We just completed pretty large cohort study of some 250 subjects, and we have a paper folding task where people do mental paper folding. And we have a really interesting cortical thickness finding that was in we were trying to understand. It was in the motor cortex, in the hand area. And we were trying to understand that. It was not in any cognitive area at all, but it was in the hand area. People were doing mental simulation, imagination of this paper folding, and better cortical thickness or higher cortical thickness in this area of the motor cortex was associated with better performance on a paper folding task. It was just fascinating, showing embodied cognition.
That's a good question. Let's go back a little bit.
I
Yeah.
have someone at the mic there.
Oh, someone's mic'd already.
No, someone at the.
Oh, okay.
Do I need?
Project. You can do it.
3 degrees below zero. What are the other? I've looked for years for books of those. What are they called in common speech? Because they're hard to find.
Rebus problems. So since you got that one here, that's 3 degrees below zero, he says. So, oops, I'm wrong. I'm not on my computer. So that one, I don't know if someone wants to shout that out. I like this one, but
Oh, I got that one.
that's 3 blind mice because they have no eyes. Okay, but we have another microphone
Question
here.
on this side?
Well, she's already at the mic, Scott. So.
Excellent.
Yeah, we've
Oh, you're
been
right
having.
there. You're like ready.
I'm right here. We've been having a very interesting conversation about creativity and genius and finding it to solve problems. And I'm sure you all have a lot of research on how being in the presence of creativity can be uplifting to people just for their frame of mind, their being happy, feeling good about things. At the health seminar, we saw a very compelling movie on the impact of music through earphones, personalized music, on elderly, demented, or physically impaired people. So I'm wondering if you all have been doing any research on how to use creativity and sort of the environment of creativity to be helpful as people age.
Unless you have something, I can start to address. So no, the answer is no, not on people aging. I haven't done anything. Whether some people are, not clear. But there's a psychologist by the name of Moshe Bar, or a cognitive neuroscientist, who actually has sort of promoting this as a partly treatment for depression, that basically encountering and understanding new ideas and new connections is itself uplifting. And we're actually looking in the lab. I mean, this sort of, I mentioned it with Jerry Swartz, you have this cascade of insights. You have more insights when you're in a positive mood. An insight puts you in a positive mood, feel good about it, you have more insights. And so some of the people that I know try to take advantage, who are practicing innovators, try to take advantage of that as well. But we haven't looked at it in particular with, say, looking at aging and dementia, but learning new things is always good.
There's hope for people who are aging, by the way. I'm working on a paper with Marty Seligman right now on aging and creativity, and we reviewed
People who aren't aging, by the way.
Is anyone in this room not aging right now? 15 factors. I just want to give hope here. We reviewed like 15 factors that we know are related to creativity, and we looked at how each one relates to aging, and we found really the most crucial, the factors that were most detrimental was fluid reasoning, like your ability to like keep things in your like memory and stuff like that. But we found there are lots of factors of creativity that increase with age, and that you can utilize that. You know, like this extensive knowledge base, diversity of experiences. Like if you get older, you know, still diversify your experiences and things of that nature. So there's a lot of hope.
And just to add to this, if there is this normal course of brain development, and we're all interested in keeping our cognitive faculties as we age, but there is this normal course of cortical development and then cortical unraveling as we age. And if some of the stuff that I presented and some of the stuff that we're seeing, that lower fidelity of certain brain networks is associated with higher creative capacity, then rather than trying to keep our intellectual faculties or this working memory faculties that older people are more worried about, there seems to be a opportunity to develop these creative capacities. In fact, that's what you see anecdotally in many older individuals that pick up creative activities as they retire in age. And it might not just be because they're retired and have more time, but because their brains are optimized to do those types of activities.
So we have negative 2 minutes left, and I wonder if we should get one more question in just for fun. Like, can you keep it really short? And
people
keep,
who want to go.
Oh, of course. You were welcome to leave at any point, whether you knew that or not. But
I'm interested in the topic of discovery versus creation of knowledge. And I've had some archetypal dreams. I've had some personal experience that are out of the normal realm that allows me to lead more towards the belief of discovery of knowledge that pre-exists.
That's awesome.
Well, it's interesting. It's the way, again, Eureka says, "I have found it," as if something was there. And so I do believe that we're always building on the shoulders of giants and learning from things that are there, and that's why you see multiple people having similar insights at the same time in scientific history, because they're all building on the knowledge that it just now became available, but they're discovering things that, as you say, it's almost like it was already there, just waiting to be observed in the right way. And sometimes we have to restructure things to see it that way, but maybe it's really just a matter of changing our perception to see them. As opposed to creating something that was brand new and never existed before. So often we think about creativity as being unique combinations of ideas as well.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Yeah.